I see the meta-crisis as this deep and complexly interrelated series of global crises and an epistemic crisis of sense-making and how we understand all of those other crises. Trying to address each of these crises in isolation, like Hercules is trying to chop off one of the heads of the Hydra, and two or more would grow back, and so the meta-crisis is very much like that. The more we try and address any of the crises in isolation, the more it kind of feeds back, and often the crises kind of get deeper. There's a sensibility of reverence and humility that's embedded in this philosophy that invites us to listen and be very curious about ourselves, each other, the world, and somehow I feel like that is actually a way of addressing the meta-crisis on a deep level, because it's actually reweaving us back into the fabric of being, so that we understand ourselves as second nature arising from the nature that produced us. So, yeah, in this presentation I want to argue that the meta-crisis is birthing a new human and also birthing a new worldview. So the meta-crisis is kind of this forcing function that's calling us to step into a new worldview and embody that as a new human, a new humanity. So it's really this kind of forcing function for humanity to clarify who are we and why are we here, and these deep existential questions. So, drawing on this philosophy that I've developed that I call Visionary Realism, which is that synthesis of integral theory and critical realism, I argue that the world itself, or what Bhaskar refers to as aletheic truth, which you could also think of as the reality principle, seems to be demanding deep transformation to new structures of consciousness that can support the emergence of new cultural and social formations that are in resonance with reality and the sacred. Sure, yeah. So such transformations are guided by this meta principle that I call aletheic resonance, which is kind of what came out the back end of all my research. And so I'll get to that. It's a little tricky to explain, but I think it will come through. So yeah, I see the meta-crisis as it's this deep and complexly interrelated series of global crises. The ecological crisis, a technological crisis, a political economic crisis, an ethical crisis, an existential or psycho-spiritual crisis, and an epistemic crisis of sense-making and how we understand all of those other crises. And the notion of meta-crisis really kind of goes beyond the idea of the polycrisis by highlighting that there's a deep network of interrelated root causes that are undergirding the polycrisis. And so that's really been my inquiry for many years, is looking into what are the root causes of the meta-crisis. And this metaphor of the Hydra I like too, of Hercules and the Hydra of Lerna, trying to address each of these crises in isolation, like Hercules is trying to chop off the head of one of the heads of the Hydra, and two or more would grow back, and so the meta-crisis is very much like that. The more we try and address any of the crises in isolation, the more it kind of feeds back, and often the crises kind of get deeper. So one of and this is my little chart that I did that kind of maps my understanding of the meta-crisis. And yeah, very difficult to convey, but try to convey this idea that the human is part and parcel of this, and in a sense the meta-crisis is behind and beyond the polycrisis. It's the deeper foundation on which the polycrisis is grounded. So I also kind of in this process was really looking into what creates systems, and how is it that we've arrived at this state? Because a lot of analyses point to things like capitalism as a root cause, but how do we get capitalism to begin with? And so through a lot of studies of sociological analyses of history and so on, I kind of came to this theory of change that is rooted in this idea that it's actually meta-theory, or these deep philosophies, that have been the most causal force in the history of humanity, really, in shaping first worldviews, and then those worldviews become the blueprint for designing social institutions and social systems and technologies. And so, yeah, I kind of this computer science metaphor of meta-theory is akin to the deep code of culture. And so we can actually go back beneath the operating systems and rewrite the deep code as a powerful way of trying to get at the root causes. Actually, I'm going to leave it there for a minute. So really I'm arguing that the state of our world reflects the state of our worldviews. And we can see that positivism and scientific materialism and constructivism, these are the prevailing meta-theories that have shaped the existing system and have been the primary drivers that we find ourselves in this context of metacrisis. So in this way, meta-theories can be understood less as these like total abstract things and more as these like powerful causal forces that are undergirding the very architecture of our social system. So basically, the inquiry then became, okay, well, we need better meta-theories. We need better big picture understandings of reality. So obviously, integral theory is arguably one of the most comprehensive, sophisticated approaches. About 15 years ago, I came across Roy Boscar's work, he forged this theory called critical realism. And so I did a deep dive into Roy's work and actually became a student of his. And that really shaped some of my thinking in a profound way. And I ended up writing a dissertation at UCL, exploring all this. So some of this is a bit from my dissertation research. So there's a lot of painstaking work that went into this. And invite any of you to follow up with me and read that if you're interested in. But I'm going to kind of try and cut to the chase and go right to some of the key insights. So critical realism has this depth ontology. It's a very deep philosophy. And so it started out in the philosophy of science, and I can't walk you through all the arguments, but it has this depth ontology that says that there's a structure to the world, and that we actually have to presuppose that structure is so for knowledge to even be possible at all. Science would not be possible if the world wasn't already structured in a very particular way. And so they make an argument that basically puts the final nail in the coffin of postmodern constructivism, which in my view is a pretty good idea. And so critical realism provides the philosophical architecture with which truth, value, and beauty can be reconstructed in a dialectic moving from modern naive realism to postmodern constructivism to a meta-modern critical or visionary realism. So it's really trying to integrate the modern and the postmodern, and then come back to realism. So this idea of a neo-realism, which I think is one of the deep themes of the integral meta-modern time that we're in, is actually a return to reality, to truth, but in a sophisticated way that integrates the insights of postmodernism and keeps us very sensitized to the ways in which our perspectives are always situated and mediated by social, linguistic, historical structures, and so on. So the philosophical and practical kind of revindication of truth couldn't be any more urgent in these times, as we can see in our rapidly decaying, polarized, crazy world. And so while integral theory clearly has this neo-realist sensibility, if we get down to the philosophical weeds of its post-metaphysical and activist philosophy, it really, I argue that it lacks the philosophical architecture with which to really buttress that position. That to really defend intrinsic truth, intrinsic value, that's a function of the cosmos and not just of human arbitrary perspective taking. So I argue that integral theory necessarily would benefit from adopting a realist depth ontology, a la Boscar and critical realism, and also that integral theory with its its developmental understanding and its epistemic taxonomy of developmental structures, critical realism, without that, critical realism kind of remains kind of naive about how do we arrive at these like very sophisticated perspectives that critical realism articulates. So we're in a sense, without that understanding, we're not really in touch with what is the engine, what is the generative force that allows us to come to these kinds of understandings that arguably can change the world, these complex systems understandings. So by integrating these developmental psychological understandings into critical realism, the pathway to collective emancipation and healing and ultimately universal self-realization is revealed. So that move also emboldens critical realism's capacity for epistemic reflexivity, both in a philosophical and practical sense, and it can also just ensure that that we successfully have integrated the insights of postmodernity. So these are pretty big things. Like critical realism without integral theory is not got what it needs to get the job done to address the meta-crisis, and arguably vice versa. Arguably, there are resources that critical realism offers that integral theory does not, that can really come together to create a much more robust understanding of the big picture and really address the meta-crisis. So when we put the two together, we can see that they cohere, but also in that process, there's like a transfiguration that needs to take place. There's like there are implications of each of those, integrating those approaches into each other, and when we really drill into it, that there's like a lot of different streams of that. Like for example, a rereading of Piaget as a realist, a rereading of developmental psychology in a realist light, which would basically return us to an understanding that all along the driver of development was the world. And that as Piaget articulated, equilibration, this kind of resonance, this alignment between our worldview or our cognitive apprehension of the world and the world itself, that's the goal. And these increasing spheres of this equilibration. So that is a proxy for what I call aletheic resonance. This resonance between the truth of the world and then our apprehension of that truth. And then in that way, we start to kind of reweave the world.